everyone. Welcome to the Detox Summit. This is Deanna Minnick. Today, our special guest is Jeffrey Smith. Now, when I think of Jeffrey Smith, I think of non-GMOs. I think of how do we create a movement against genetically modified organisms in our food supply, in our environment. He's really the expert here, and it's such a privilege to have him as part of the summit, as part of the panel of different experts. For those of you who don't know who Jeffrey Smith is, he's an international best-selling author and filmmaker. He's also the executive director of the Institute of Responsible Technology. And if you have not seen this website, you must check it out. It's a resource haven of so many different things, so many different aspects to health, wellness, looking at genetically modified organisms. Definitely go to the website, and we'll hear more about that as we progress through the interview. So welcome, Jeffrey, to the Detox Summit.
Thank you.
Such a delight to have you as part of the whole panel again. And I remember when I first got your book some years ago, one of my mentors, Jeffrey Bland, had placed it on my desk. It was Genetic Roulette. And I remember being so impressed. I mean, it was a textbook. It was thick with science and literature all about the dangers of GMOs. And so it made quite an impression upon me. And so I just find it such a delight to have you here today with me to talk about your journey.
That was interesting. Jeff Bland first heard me speak for about 15 minutes years ago. And then we broke at this conference for dinner. And by the time he joined me at dinner, he said he had just ordered 65 copies of Seeds of Deception for all of the scientific contributors to his company and his work. And I was blown away. And then he invited me again to speak in an interview with him for his clinicians review, which was the first time in 25 years he interviewed a non-clinician. So I was very impressed with Jeff Bland, and for good reason. But yes, he's very much into the deep molecules that run this body, and I'm loving to talk about with you some of the deep molecular changes that GMOs can create and why we want to avoid them and how.
Well, I can't wait. I've been looking forward to this all day. So before we get there, I first want everybody to have a better understanding of you and your own personal journey. So who is Jeffrey Smith, and how did you get into GMOs? How did you make this your path? I'm really curious to hear your story.
Well, I went to a lecture by a molecular biologist, a genetic engineer, in 1996, and learned firsthand that the science was nowhere near ready to be used for our food supply. That there was all sorts of unpredicted side effects that could occur as a result of the process of genetic engineering. And moreover, once it was released outdoors as genetically modified crops, there was no technology that could recall the self-propagating pollution of the gene pool back into the bottle. So we're talking about a technology that can influence negatively everyone who eats, and then, because it's planted outdoors, negatively influence all living organisms for all future generations. And it was being approved basically in the stealth night, when people hardly knew anything about it in 1996. And here was a lone voice that I had heard, a scientist who was actually an award-winning genetic engineer, saying that it wasn't ready. So I figured he needed some help translating the science into English so other people could understand and appreciate the risks. And so I started then what I've been doing since, and that is interviewing scientists, translating their concerns, compiling the dangers, and getting it spread far and wide. And since then, I have 2 books and 3 movies, and I've been to about 40 countries and testified. I did testifying today before a board. And I need to get the word out. And now we actually have a tremendous impact on the world's situation with GMOs. It's a very positive situation we're looking at in terms of our impact, and I can talk more about that at the end.
Well, let's start very basic for our listeners, and maybe we start with a primer and a definition of what genetically modified organisms are. Maybe let's start there. And why are they toxic? Because that's really the focus of this summit, is to look at the toxins in our environment and how they make their way into our bodies. So what are GMOs and why are they toxic?
Well, GMOs are, in this case, we're talking about plants, but it could be animals or any living organism DNA. You take genes from species like bacteria or viruses and you force it into the DNA of plants so that the plants now express proteins that were never part of its natural design or makeup. Now, the reason why they are toxic is manyfold. There's at least 5 or 6 different reasons or ways that GMOs can be toxic, and we can spend a little time on each. First, I'd like to introduce the main reason they genetically engineer, and that is to allow the crops to be sprayed with a toxic weed killer, primarily Roundup. So you have Roundup ready soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa, all genetically engineered so you can spray Monsanto's Roundup herbicide over the top of the field and not kill the crops. Now, that should lead to a clear reason, number one, why these foods are toxic, because the Roundup gets absorbed into the plant, into the food portion which we consume. Now, Roundup turns out to be described by scientists as probably the most chronically toxic chemical on the planet, given its widespread potential for harm and its widespread use. So its exposure in the environment. I live in the Midwest, and 60 to 100% of the air samples and rain samples contain this most popular herbicide. Now, in terms of detox, I think I want to mention foremost that Roundup interferes with a metabolic pathway called the P450 cytochrome pathway, or in other words, the CYP enzymes, which are critical for detoxing the liver. So if you get exposed to any of thousands and thousands of chemicals or heavy metals, etc., and you're burdening the liver, or the liver's taking up the job to remove these toxins from the body, if you're also exposed to Roundup or its active ingredient glyphosate, you are basically putting a hand behind the back of the body to do the detoxification, because these very, very important CYP enzymes are now messed up. That's a technical term. And your liver then becomes unable to as efficiently remove these toxins from the body. Now, Roundup also is a potent antibiotic, and it's selective in that it kills in the gut the beneficial gut bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, but not E. coli, salmonella, or botulism. It turns out that it kills some of the positive bacteria that normally keep in check the negative bacteria. So there's an outbreak of high levels of botulism toxin in cows, and they've traced it, so it's probably the impact of the Roundup and the Roundup ready food eaten by the cows that kills the beneficial gut bacteria that normally prevents the overgrowth of the Clostridium botulinum, which produces the bot toxin, which is one of the most toxic compounds on the planet. And it's linked also to sudden infant death syndrome. Many of the children who have died from sudden infant death syndrome turn out to have botulism, chronic levels of botulism, and it's also linked to chronic fatigue. Now, in addition, when we have the killing of the beneficial gut bacteria in the gut by the Roundup, then it can cause an overgrowth of the negative gut bacteria, which can produce a toxic gas, which can cause irritation in the gut. It can also produce zonulin, which can cause the opening of the gaps in the cell walls of the intestines, causing leaky gut. And leaky gut is linked to a lot of diseases, cancer, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, inflammation, autoimmune disease, etc., whereby undigested food proteins, chemicals in the gut, and bacteria can get into the bloodstream and wreak havoc. So that's another way that GMOs are toxic indirectly, by exposing toxins in the gut into the bloodstream and into the organs that way. Now, Roundup also is an endocrine disruptor. It also can promote cancer in certain laboratory settings, so it's likely to be a potent carcinogen. It also chelates, meaning it binds with minerals, trace minerals like manganese, magnesium, combined with calcium, selenium, cobalt, and so it basically can block the ability for the body to participate in certain metabolic pathways that require these trace minerals. So by blocking the ability for the body to use or absorb these trace minerals, it has a toxic effect. In addition, there was a study that came out that linked Roundup with kidney failure in plantations where it's sprayed a lot by the workers who end up dying for lack of kidney function. And they found that it can bind with arsenic, and then their theory is that it can move through the liver, not affecting the liver because it's bound with the glyphosate molecule. Then it gets into the kidneys where it becomes unbound because of the acidic nature of the kidney, and then you have two toxins in the kidney, arsenic and the herbicide Roundup, which can be very damaging. There was a study done for 90 days on rats that ate Roundup-ready corn, and they found signs of toxicity in the liver and kidneys. So a scientist, Dr. Seralini from France, extended the study for 2 years and confirmed the toxicity in the liver, kidneys, and pituitary, as well as 2 to 3 times the rate of early death, and as well as multiple massive tumors in both the males and female rats compared to the controls. And if you look at the other animal feeding studies on the Roundup-ready crops, you see rather significant endocrine disruption and reproductive failure. You see sterility, up to a 5-fold increase in infant mortality, birth defects, stunted growth among offspring, etc. With hamsters, it wasn't until the 3rd generation that most of the effects appeared. Most of the animals were sterile, and many had hair growing in their mouths. So Roundup, just to summarize on Roundup, there was a study review paper published last year by Samsel and Seneff, and I interviewed Stephanie Seneff, and you can find it on YouTube. Just Google Stephanie Seneff and Jeffrey Smith glyphosate or Roundup. And you'll see a reference to the paper where they link Roundup to, they say, basically all of the diseases of a Western diet: obesity, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, infertility, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, anorexia, aggression, depression, and autism. And then the same authors wrote an article this year linking it to gluten sensitivity. And if you go to glutenandgmos.com, you'll see why consumption of GMOs in general and Roundup in particular can predispose the body to reaction to gluten. So what we've done is we've just done a tour of one single aspect of toxicity, which I'm sorry to say is now not just limited to Roundup-ready crops, since Roundup is sprayed on numerous types of grains, beans, fruits, and vegetables before harvest as a ripening agent. So you'll find it in wheat products and rye and barley and potatoes, etc. So it's good to avoid that by going organic and not just non-GMO in order to avoid the Roundup.
So Jeffrey, what a beautiful way to contextualize all of this research for us. There's quite a lot just on the first point of talking about Roundup. I'm just wondering if we just look at this philosophically and kind of zoom out of the situation and look into it, it just seems like a duh, right? It seems like, there's so many toxic outcomes of Roundup. Why do we still have this in our agricultural supply, and why are we continuing to see the use of it?
The influence of Monsanto has been legendary on the U.S. government, and they were the producers of Roundup, and they consistently lied, even were convicted of false advertising, claiming, for example, that Roundup was biodegradable, even though it can take as long as 22 years to just break down 50% as a half-life, depending on the soil conditions. So they used to come out saying it was safer than table salt and that it was completely harmless. And they spent a lot of money promoting those lies. And they spent a lot of money trying to distort or deny the evidence that's now available. The evidence on the toxicity of Roundup has gone skyrocketing in the last 3 years. And it's a very, very serious issue. These articles that I just referenced really put it into context where they talk about how Roundup does this. And a study was just done last month, which showed that it can act as an excitotoxin in the brain with glutamate, and it's linking it to some of the influence that MSG has and people are sensitive to it. So we're starting to basically understand some of the causation behind this, but it's still vehemently denied by both the biotech industry and the US government. So one of the USDA researchers, Robert Kramer, did some research on Roundup, and he wasn't able to publish in the United States. And he's not, the USDA is not taking seriously his research, even though he works for the USDA. And, he said, isn't it kind of like, duh? Well, as Joel Salatin says, instead of calling the USDA, he calls it the US duh, because they're simply avoiding, and they do not even evaluate the residue levels of Roundup in food or humans. The U.S. Geological Survey did in terms of air and rain, but we think that there's high levels of Roundup. In fact, the EPA just increased the allowable levels of Roundup on all these different fruits and vegetables and grains, not because it's considered safe, but because those are the levels that we're finding anyway, and they just legalized what was existing that were already in place.
Wow.
Now, just to highlight just how powerful Monsanto is in the halls of government, the person who was in charge of policy at the FDA was Monsanto's former attorney, Michael Taylor, and later became Monsanto's vice president and chief lobbyist, and now he's back at the FDA as the U.S. food safety czar. And the policy that he oversaw falsely claimed that the agency wasn't aware of any information showing that GMOs were significantly different. And on the basis of that lie, no safety studies or labeling was necessary from the FDA side. The documents made public from a lawsuit years later showed that the overwhelming consensus among the scientists working at the FDA was exactly the opposite. That GMOs were different and dangerous, could lead to toxins, allergens, etc., and that they should be subjected to rigorous long-term studies, including human studies. That was all ignored, and the existence of those methods denied until they were made public.
So, I'm just thinking of, this whole idea of safety and whether or not GMOs are safe. It sounds like, and what I know from your books, is that there is just a plethora of science out there to support showing that they're unsafe. Can you give us just an idea of the breadth of articles? Are we talking hundreds? Are we talking thousands?
Unfortunately, because the FDA does not require any safety studies, and the other countries that do require studies require virtually nothing, the amount of safety studies that have been done have been pathetic and tragic and very, very dangerous, because we're feeding a product as immature science to billions of people, and yet there's only been a handful of studies that qualify as academic safety studies. Nonetheless, when the American Academy of Environmental Medicine reviewed the existing studies, particularly animal feeding studies, in 2009, they said there was clear evidence, causal evidence, that the GM feed was linking to gastrointestinal problems, immune disorders, reproductive dysfunction, dysfunction of cholesterol and insulin regulation, organ damage, accelerated aging. They said every doctor should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient, and thousands of doctors are in fact doing that. Many are reporting that their patients get better from many of the diseases and disorders that were afflicting the lab animals, as found by the review by the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. When people get rid of GMOs, they have to buy organic or switch to unprocessed foods or something because they're not labeled. So that introduces cofactors that might also explain the weight loss, the reduction of headaches, the gastrointestinal improvements, the cleared up skin conditions, the reduced brain fog, the more energy, things that I hear every day from people who eliminated GMOs, as well as behavioral problems with children, autistic symptoms, violent behavior, etc. But when livestock are taken off of GMOs, there's no cofactors because it only switches GM feed to non-GM feed. And so when the animals in the livestock arena get better from these same disorders and diseases, as well as the live animals, it gives us a lot of confidence that we know why people are getting better when they switch to non-GMO diets. And now it's the same with pets as well. cats and dogs. We have lots of stories from pet owners and veterinarians. When you look at these specific diseases and disorders, the gastrointestinal, irritable bowel, inflammatory bowel, chronic constipation, death from intestinal infection, plus autism and all these other things, they go up in parallel with the introduction and expansion of GMO acreage in the United States, as well as the use of Roundup. And if you look at the two main toxins in GMOs, and we've discussed only one of the two, but which is Roundup, if you look at the other one as well, which is Bt toxin, an insecticide produced by genetically modified corn and cotton, then they predispose humans and animals to these same types of diseases and disorders. So, for example, the Bt toxin kills insects by poking holes in the cell walls of their stomach and killing them. It turns out it also pokes holes in human cells, according to a 2012 study. It also ends up in our blood. It was found in the blood of 93% of the pregnant women tested and 80% of our unborn fetuses. Well, studies on mice show that if it's in the blood of mice, it's cytotoxic, so it can cause damage to the red blood cells. So if it's in our blood in North America, it could be toxic to our blood. And if it's in the unborn fetuses, as it appears to be in very large numbers, then it might get into their brain because the blood-brain barrier is not well developed, in which case it can be a hole-poking toxin in the brain of the offspring of this generation. On top of that, the Bt toxin has been shown to damage the microvilli, which are the intestinal fingers that stick out from the walls of the intestines. Roundup does that too. It may cause leaky gut with the holes that it pokes. Roundup can do that too. And it's also a potent allergen, according to both human and animal studies. Now, what's interesting is that the only human feeding study ever conducted on commercialized GM crops proved that the genes inserted into soybeans, making the soybeans Roundup ready, transferred into the DNA of bacteria living inside our intestines and may continue to function once they have been inserted. Now, what this means is that long after we stop eating GMOs, our own gut bacteria may produce genetically modified proteins 24/7 around the clock. Now, they only check this with Roundup Ready soybeans, and the protein that it produces has properties of a dust mite allergen, so it might trigger immune responses. They never checked to see if corn chips consumption transforms our gut bacteria into living pesticide factories. And that might, if it does, that might explain why so many people in Canada, 93% of the pregnant women tested, had Bt toxin in their blood. It would normally wash out pretty quickly, and it's not Mexico where they eat corn tortillas every day. The writers of the study suggested that the consumption must have come from the milk and meat of animals fed GM corn, but I think a more plausible explanation is that our own gut bacteria has been colonized by the DNA from corn products, and that now we're producing the toxin 24/7 inside our own digestive tract.
So you're talking a lot about the gut, and I think that this is a focal point for us at the Detox Summit. We've had a number of different experts, Dr. Perlmutter, Dr. O'Brien, Dr. Fine, all talking about gluten as a toxin. And one of the things that we spoke about, as the listeners will recall, is why the response to gluten can be variable in different parts of the world. And I've even had this personally. So just to bring it to kind of the personal level, everything that you're saying, when I go to Europe, if I go to France and have a baguette, and it's not that I'm a huge bread eater, but if I do treat myself and just let go and have a baguette, it doesn't seem like I have a reaction. However, if I have a morsel of bread here in the United States, I definitely do get some symptoms, or at least, something subtle to make me think that something is off. So I'm just wondering, this whole issue of gluten that we're hearing so much about, is it because of gluten, or is it because of genetically modified gluten, or are our guts just in bad shape in general because we've been exposed to so many GMOs? I guess I've got kind of a clustering of different questions there all around the gut.
Well, it's an excellent question, and I'm fully prepared to answer that since I wrote a 24-page article with research support from Tom O'Brien and MIT Stephanie Seneff and Tom Malterre, who's an expert at this, as well as Sergi Info. We wrote an article about GMOs and gluten sensitivity, and this was followed up by a more recent article on glyphosate, Roundup's active ingredient in gluten-related disorders, by Stephanie Seneff and Anthony Sampson. I just interviewed Stephanie Seneff about it, and I'm editing the interview right now, and we'll be releasing that shortly. So it turns out that if you look at the symptoms associated with gluten-related disorders, including the more extreme example of celiac disease, many of those can be produced by consumption of GMOs in general or Roundup in particular. You have negative gut bacteria overgrowth, you have suppressed digestive abilities, damage to the microvilli, leaky gut, immune system response, and then you also have certain biochemical signatures of reduction of certain maybe serotonin and vitamin D and B12 and things like that. The generic major categories of gut bacteria we talked about that could easily be caused through Roundup problems. Roundup and Bt toxin can damage the microvilli. Both Roundup and Bt toxin can lead to leaky gut. Bt itself can promote immune system responses, and by damaging the gut bacteria, the immune system that's found in the gut bacteria can be dismantled, which can then cause immune problems. The leaky gut can create immune system problems and autoimmunity because the immune system can react to the undigested food proteins and interpret their shape and size as similar to the shape and size of tissues and compounds within the body, so it can attack things in the body like transglutaminase or the thyroid or this thing, and so it becomes an autoimmune disease. All of those are things that can be exacerbated or produced theoretically through GMO consumption. I asked Stephanie Seneff, who wrote this very extensive paper with Anthony Sampson about the specific biochemistry markers of gluten-related disorders and how it's related to Roundup. And I said, is there anything that you have found in the gluten world, symptom-wise, that cannot be explained by Roundup or glyphosate? And she said, no, it fits like a hand in a glove. Now, that doesn't mean that all gluten-related disorders must have Roundup to mediate the response. Gluten itself, irrespective of Roundup, can, with sensitive individuals, I'm told, like Tom O'Brien, for example, just yesterday, can promote reactivity. But if you end up causing gut problems, leaky gut, gut overgrowth of gut bacteria, immune system overload, and damage to the microvilli in advance because of GMOs, it's theoretically possible that that could create gluten sensitivity in individuals who would otherwise not be sensitive. Now, we've heard also the very opposite, that people who are gluten sensitive, who stop eating GMOs, give up their gluten sensitivity. They no longer react to gluten. Or some people who've been taken off of wheat but have been continuing to eat corn, but they still end up with some gastrointestinal distress when they realize that it's genetically engineered corn. They switch to non-GM corn, then that gastrointestinal response goes away. So in that case, they may not be responding at all to gluten because they've already gotten rid of the gluten in their diet, but they're responding to the GMOs. And there's practitioners like Dr. Emily Lindner who said that when she takes someone off of gluten, she always tells them to stop eating GMOs so the recovery is faster and more complete.
So thank you. So it does seem that genetically modified foods may perturb the system and start creating this ripple effect. I'm just wondering, Jeffrey, I guess at the end of the day, we all want to know, is it possible to eat a non-GMO diet? Are we able to find foods, to select foods? Is going organic enough?
I'm going to answer that, but I want to just put a bookmark on it and answer one more example of what the toxicity of GMOs is, because we didn't really exhaust it. There's a few more categories.
Please do.
Because this is, after all, a detox summit, so people should get to know their toxins before they eat. All right. Right now we talked about the two main GMO traits, the Roundup Ready, and then there's the Bt toxin. There's also zucchini, yellow squash, and papaya that are designed with viral genes to fend off a particular plant virus, and it produces viral proteins. And the viral proteins, this is not the category I'm going to get to. This is another aside. We're digressing. So the viral proteins that are produced by these can be toxic. They've been known to cause toxic reactions as a class. Viral proteins can create toxic reactions and potentially promote cancer, but they can also help dismantle the body's ability to prevent viral infection. So they work with the virus to dismantle viral defenses. So that's another way that you can have a toxic type reaction with GMOs. But the other piece is those were specific genes inserted. We looked at the Roundup Ready, we looked at the Bt toxin, we looked at the viral genes. There's also a generic genetically engineered crop, which means irrespective of what gene you insert, the process of insertion, which is typically done by shooting millions of genes into a plate of cells with a gene gun or using bacteria to infect the cell, and then cloning that cell into a crop, that creates massive collateral damage in the DNA of the crop. And you can change the levels of expression of genes throughout the DNA, the normal, natural functioning DNA. So they've done experimental tests where they've inserted, for example, a tobacco gene. It was from tobacco, and they just inserted multiple copies and were surprised to find out that there was a toxin that increased by 200-fold, completely out of the blue. They had no idea why it occurred. So you can end up with new toxins that have never before existed in the crop being produced by this massive collateral damage as a result of the process of genetic engineering. Or you can take existing toxins and massively increase their presence. So this is not evaluated by and large in the GM crops put on the market. They don't do a complete analysis of the proteins produced. And one time someone finally did an analysis of all the proteins created in Monsanto's most popular corn variety and found that there was indeed a gene that was switched on that's normally silent that produces an allergen. It's not found in natural corn. They found 42 other genes that were vastly upregulated and downregulated. They found proteins that were completely truncated and changed their shape, which could turn a harmless protein into a very dangerous, possibly deadly one. So that's just the generic process of genetic engineering, which can cause these problems. Now, not only is the protein potentially toxic, but DNA produces RNA, which produces protein. The RNA could be toxic. There's certain regulatory elements called double-stranded RNA, which can change genes' expression up and down the genome. And it's an extremely dangerous technology that we're actually consciously introducing double-stranded RNA into our food supply. And there was a study done with honeybees where they took double-stranded RNA and they found one that they figured was absolutely safe. They were going to use it as a control to just demonstrate that it had no impact on gene expression of the genome of the honeybee. It actually changed 1,100 genes. So the expression levels of 1,100 genes changed when a single double-stranded DNA was inserted into their diet. So this is extremely dangerous, and you end up creating all sorts of opportunities for rogue short pieces of RNA to be produced when you genetically engineer and create all that massive collateral damage. So these are all very, very serious potential toxins, allergens, carcinogens, nutrient changes that can occur generically from GMOs.
It's so discomforting to think that our food supply is dangerous and that it's laden with all of these compounds. So how do we navigate this? How do we eat in a place not of fear but of empowerment? And how do we start to make better selections?
Well, we have a website called non-GMOshoppingguide.com. It's also cloned into an iPhone app, Shop No GMO. And there's more than 16,000 products that are third-party verified as non-GMO. And so buying products listed in the guide is one way. Now, you can also look at the label. It's not required to be labeled if it's GMO, but many companies are labeling their products as non-GMO. And so if you look for that, that'll certainly help. And the non-GMO project verified seal is the best of those. You can also buy products that say organic on the front of the label because they're not allowed to intentionally use GMOs. And if you don't see a non-GMO label or organic label and it's not listed in the shopping guide, look in the shopping guide for the at-risk ingredients. You'll find these 9 GM crops are already commercialized, and these are the only food crops that are commercialized. Soy, corn, cotton used for cottonseed oil, canola for canola oil, sugar beets for sugar, alfalfa for animal feed, papaya from Hawaii or China, and some zucchini or yellow squash. Now, popcorn is not yet genetically engineered. There's no more GM tomatoes in the market, no more potatoes in the market. Seedless watermelons and pluots are not GMO. That comes from selective breeding. The uniform produce has nothing to do with whether it's GMO or not. That's selective breeding. That's just using sexual reproduction. It's not the laboratory technique of gene insertion. In addition to the 9 crops, you have the derivatives of those 9 crops listed in our hidden invisible ingredients list, and that would include dextrose, maltodextrin, high fructose corn syrup, and many things that you don't know are actually derivatives of soy and corn, or in one case, aspartame, the sweetener, comes from genetically modified bacteria. You also have genetically engineered bovine growth hormone, which is injected into cows to increase milk supply, ushered out of most American dairies, but some still use it, and that increases in the milk from treated cows. There's more pus, more antibiotics, more bovine growth hormone, and more of the cancer-promoting IGF-1. And you also have the milk, meat, and eggs from animals that have been fed GMOs. To avoid that, you can buy organic milk, meat, and eggs, wild caught, or 100% grass-fed, where alfalfa is not one of the grasses used, or GM alfalfa. GM, not all the alfalfa is genetically modified, so ideally they should say 100% grass-fed, no GMO alfalfa. Now, people will have to make their purchasing decisions based on what they think they can accomplish, afford, and have access to. So, in my opinion, it doesn't have to be all or none. People have to just take the decisions as they can. And I think one of the easiest motivators to get people to avoid GMOs is to watch the film Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives. We found that it's the most effective tool for changing people's diet on the spot. Many people will actually empty their cupboards after watching the film. So if someone who's been listening to the Detox Summit wants to stop eating GMOs, but their spouse or their parents or their children or someone in their household is not so convinced and hasn't heard the lecture or the talks, it's easier to, you can obviously replay this, but you can also watch the film Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives. And typically the discussion after the film is, what can we do to stop eating GMOs in our lives? When going out to eat, you can often see the GM at-risk ingredients on the plate, corn tortillas, corn polenta, tofu, etc. If you buy junk food or fast food, it's going to be GMO because if something is highly processed, it's probably going to contain the soy, corn derivatives of the cottonseed canola derivatives or the sugar derivatives. So if you go to a restaurant that cooks from scratch, then note the invisible GMOs would be the cooking oil and the salad dressing in particular, because they would be from soy, corn, cottonseed, or canola oils. So that's the way to avoid eating GMOs in restaurants. And I always just call the restaurant in advance, ask them what oil they use, and then find out if they have an entree. If they use, for example, vegetable oil, which really means soybean oil, I'll find out if they have pure olive oil and cook in some other way so that I'm not exposed to GMOs, because that's what I've decided is to not be exposed even to the cooking oil used in the restaurants.
That's fantastic. What great takeaways. So, Jeffrey, in our close here, I'm just wondering if there's one thing that all of us can do as consumers, the power to vote with our purchases. Would you say it is on the food side, or would you say that we need to be more advocates of the labeling law? What would be one thing that you'd like to make sure that everybody can do as an actionable?
Actually, what I'd like to do is for people to go to our website, responsibletechnology.org, and sign up for our free newsletter. Because within the newsletter, we'll be giving lots of different opportunities. And right now, we have a window of opportunity to stop GMOs through a tipping point of consumer rejection. There was a tipping point in Europe in 1999 following a lifting of a gag order of a scientist doing research on GMOs. He could tell what he knew about the dangers. Hundreds of articles reported it to Europeans who became concerned, and GMOs were kicked out of the food supply by the European food companies, not by the government. Bovine growth hormone was kicked out of Walmart, Starbucks, Yoplait, Dannon, and most American dairies by consumer concern and people seeking to avoid bovine growth hormone. The natural food industry in the United States last year reached a tipping point against GMOs, kicking out most GMOs, or they're in the process of it now. The use of GM ingredients was a clear marketing liability in the natural food industry, and that became apparent to all of the marketers in the food sector. Now we have a sample non-GMO product, grape nuts, an original grape nuts formula, non-GMO project verified, marked on the front of the package, reaching supermarkets right now. If we can move the needle on market share of grape nuts or other products that declare non-GMO in the conventional supermarkets, then we will see a tipping point when the rest of the food industry realizes they can't afford to wait until their competitor declares non-GMO first. So we are now in the most important window of opportunity in the history of anti-GMO activism, and we need to raise money to educate people who shop in Walmart and Safeway, etc., to avoid eating the GMOs and to go to the non-GMO products. So we're actually targeting the demographic groups most likely to heed our call, which is moms, pet owners, healthcare professionals, people who are suffering from chronic illness that we believe is related to the GMO consumption, and faith-based organizations who believe that GMO really means God move over and are looking for an excuse to direct their congregations to avoid eating GMOs. And so we have a plan, a 5-year plan actually, to eliminate GMOs not only as direct ingredients, but also as animal feed by creating a tipping point in the conventional supermarkets, which we think will happen this year and at the latest next year, and then doing something similar with animal feed. So we are actually right now looking at a master plan. We're looking for support for that plan financially, support for that plan for people to become click and send Revolutionary Army members where they can post everything that we send out and share with their friends. We're providing materials that people can share with their healthcare professionals, with moms in the area, with schools, etc. And so it's really a strike while the iron is hot. And this is the most important window. We have 2 futures we're looking at, Deanna. One is Monsanto's ideal future, as told to their consultant years ago, which is 100% of all commercial seeds genetically engineered and patented. It's expanded beyond seeds now. They want to genetically engineer the insects, livestock, fish, trees, and all living beings, essentially replace nature. And we have an alternative future to, which is to preserve nature. And it's so weird, ironic, crazy, and unbelievable that in 100 years, when they look back to figure out what it was that saved the genetic integrity of our food supply and of our ecosystem, it may come down to sales of grape nuts at Walmart.
Very well said. Very eloquent. And for those of you who did not catch the website for the Institute for Responsible Technology, it is www.responsibletechnology.org. Jeffrey, thank you for being a part of the Detox Summit, for being a part of this movement. And it definitely aligns to the movement that you're creating around GMOs. And we applaud your efforts. And we're really grateful to have you as part of this summit.
Thank you so much.